The static crackled through Sergeant Lysander Kowalski's headset as he hunched over his radio equipment in the makeshift communications bunker, 40 miles southeast of Bastogne. December 22, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge raged around them, but in this moment, in this freezing cellar beneath what remained of a Belgian farmhouse, the only sound that mattered was the intercepted German transmission bleeding through the atmospheric interference. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the frequency dial, not from the cold that bit through his wool gloves, but from what he was hearing. The Wehrmacht officer's voice was clinical, methodical, as he confirmed the coordinates for Operation Vergeltung, a massive artillery bombardment and subsequent infantry assault planned for dawn. The target was not a military installation. It was the city of Liège, where over 200,000 civilians huddled in their homes, unaware that in 6 hours their world would be obliterated. Kowalski's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he reached for his transmission key, knowing full well that his next action would violate every protocol in the Signal Corps manual. But sometimes rules existed to be shattered by conscience. No one in the 9th Army Signal Battalion knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the mathematics of survival for an entire city. Lysander Kowalski had grown up in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where his father, Stanislaw, worked 16-hour shifts forging the backbone of American industry. The Kowalski family lived in a narrow row house on Bigelow Street, where the windows rattled with every passing freight train, and the air tasted perpetually of iron and coal smoke. Lysander was the middle son among his siblings, distinguished not by exceptional strength like his older brothers, but by an unusual gift for hearing patterns in chaos. While other young men in the neighborhood played baseball in the vacant lots between the mills, Lysander spent hours by the family's Philco radio, fascinated by the way voices traveled through static, how distant signals could be coaxed from the electromagnetic soup that filled the airwaves. His mother, Anna, often found him with his ear pressed against the radio's wooden cabinet, claiming he could hear conversations from Chicago, sometimes even New York. His father dismissed this as youthful imagination until the night 17-year-old Lysander correctly predicted a thunderstorm by listening to the subtle changes in radio interference patterns. By his final year of secondary education, he had built his own crystal radio set and was communicating with amateur operators across 3 states. When Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, Lysander was 19 years old, working part-time at the Westinghouse plant and studying electrical engineering through correspondence courses. He enlisted the next morning, not out of patriotic fervor, but because he understood that this war would be won or lost on the invisible battlefield of communications. During basic training at Fort Benning, his instructors quickly recognized his exceptional ability to isolate signals from background noise, a skill that would prove invaluable in the chaos of modern warfare. He could distinguish between the subtle differences in enemy radio protocols, identify operators by their distinctive keying patterns, and somehow extract intelligible transmissions from atmospheric conditions that left other radiomen hearing only static. His fellow trainees initially viewed him with suspicion, the quiet Polish-American from Pittsburgh, who could make radio sing when others heard only silence. But respect gradually replaced skepticism, as Kowalski's abilities consistently provided his unit with intelligence that kept them alive. He had no idea that soon those same instincts would be all that stood between a city and annihilation. The winter of 1944 had brought Hitler's most desperate gamble to the forests of the Ardennes. Germany's last major offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was designed to split the Allied forces, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and potentially force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. The operation caught Allied intelligence completely off guard. On December 16th, over 200,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, smashed through what Allied commanders had considered a quiet sector of the front. The German plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. 3 entire armies, the 5th Panzer Army, the 6th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army, would drive northwest through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and advance all the way to Antwerp. The offensive initially achieved stunning success. American forces, thinly spread across the Ardennes front, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. The 106th Infantry Division virtually ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to defend the critical crossroads town of Bastogne, found itself completely encircled. But the German plan contained a darker element that Allied intelligence had failed to detect. Parallel to the main offensive, Wehrmacht planners had developed a series of supplementary operations designed to terrorize civilian populations and disrupt Allied supply lines. Operation Vergeltung, German for retribution, called for massive artillery bombardments of strategic cities in Belgium and Luxembourg, followed by rapid infantry advances to occupy these urban centers before Allied forces could mount effective defenses. The psychological impact of losing major population centers, German planners believed, would accelerate the collapse of Allied morale and potentially trigger civilian uprisings against the occupying forces. Intelligence officers in Berlin had calculated that the capture of cities like Liège, with its crucial rail junctions and industrial facilities, would cripple Allied logistics while demonstrating German capability to strike deep behind enemy lines. What made Operation Vergeltung particularly sinister was its reliance on surprise. German units would advance under cover of darkness, position their artillery in prepared positions, and commence bombardment at dawn, giving civilian populations no opportunity for evacuation. The operation had been planned with typical German precision, but like many Wehrmacht strategies in the final years of the war, it depended on assumptions about Allied response times that were increasingly divorced from battlefield reality. German commanders believed they could achieve their objectives before Allied forces could coordinate effective countermeasures, but they had underestimated both the resilience of American logistics and the determination of individual soldiers to exceed their orders when human lives hung in the balance. The intercepted transmission that reached Kowalski's radio position had originated from Oberst Friedrich Mannheim, commanding the 15th Artillery Regiment, positioned in concealed emplacements 12 miles southwest of Liège. Mannheim's voice, speaking precise German through the atmospheric static, was confirming final coordinates with his battery commanders for a pre-dawn bombardment that would commence in exactly 5 hours and 37 minutes. The German colonel's words carried the casual efficiency of a man ordering supplies rather than orchestrating mass destruction. Ziel coordinates 5058 north, 00534 east. Fire mission begins 0500 hours. 200 rounds high explosive, followed by incendiary shells to target designated structures. Infantry advance commences 0545. Kowalski's limited German vocabulary was sufficient to understand the horrifying implications. The coordinates corresponded precisely to Liège's city center, where medieval churches and narrow streets created a densely packed urban area that would channel the force of explosive shells into maximum destruction. 200 high explosive rounds followed by incendiaries meant the Germans intended not merely to damage the city, but to ignite fires that would consume everything the initial bombardment had not destroyed. The timing was calculated for maximum psychological impact. Dawn raids, when people would be awakening in their homes, trapped in buildings that would become death chambers within minutes. As Kowalski continued monitoring the German frequency, additional transmissions revealed the full scope of the operation. 3 other artillery regiments were positioning for simultaneous attacks on other Belgian cities, while rapid advance infantry units prepared to exploit the chaos by occupying urban areas before organized resistance could develop. The Wehrmacht planners had anticipated that Allied forces would be too focused on containing the main Ardennes offensive to respond effectively to these secondary operations. Protocol demanded that Kowalski immediately forward this intelligence through proper channels to 9th Army headquarters, where staff officers would evaluate the information, coordinate with other intelligence sources, and develop appropriate responses. But proper channels took time, precious time, that the civilians of Liège did not have. Standard military communications protocol required verification of intercepted enemy transmissions, correlation with existing intelligence reports, and approval from at least 2 command levels before any action could be taken, even under optimal conditions. This process consumed a minimum of 3 hours. Under current battlefield conditions, with communications networks strained by the ongoing German offensive, response time could easily extend to 6 or 8 hours. By the time Allied forces received, verified, and acted upon Kowalski's intelligence, the bombardment of Liège would be complete and thousands of civilians would be dead. Sitting in his freezing bunker, listening to German officers calmly plan mass murder, Lysander Kowalski faced the defining choice of his life. His commanding officer, Captain Aurelius Blackstone, had been explicit about communications protocol during their final briefing before taking up positions in the Ardennes sector. Under no circumstances, Blackstone had emphasized, stabbing his finger at the assembled radio operators, will any member of this unit initiate unauthorized transmissions. Enemy monitoring of our communications frequencies is constant and sophisticated. Any deviation from approved protocols compromises operational security for every Allied unit in the sector. The captain's concerns were not theoretical. German signals intelligence had repeatedly demonstrated their ability to exploit Allied communications for tactical advantage. Just 3 weeks earlier, a careless radio transmission from an American reconnaissance unit had revealed the location of a supply depot, resulting in a devastating Luftwaffe attack that destroyed thousands of tons of ammunition and killed 17 soldiers. Military protocol existed for fundamental reasons, and Kowalski understood those reasons perfectly. But he also understood that sometimes following rules meant collaborating with mass murder through inaction. The nearest Allied unit with authority to respond to the German threat was the British 11th Armored Division, positioned 23 miles northeast of his location. More importantly, the 11th Armored maintained direct communication links with Belgian civil defense authorities in Liège, who possessed both the authority and capability to coordinate emergency evacuations. But reaching the British required transmitting on frequencies that American forces were specifically prohibited from using without prior authorization. Worse yet, warning the civilians of Liège would require broadcasting on emergency civilian frequencies, an action that Captain Blackstone had explicitly forbidden as a violation of operational security protocols. Kowalski checked his watch. 0230 hours. Dawn approached with the inevitability of execution. He could follow protocol, forward his intelligence through proper channels, and pray that the military bureaucracy would respond faster than ever before in recorded history. Or he could violate every regulation in the Signal Corps manual and save a city. The choice crystallized with absolute clarity. Some rules existed to preserve order, others existed to preserve life. When those two purposes conflicted, Lysander Kowalski chose life. He adjusted his radio to the emergency frequency used by British forces and began composing the message that would transform him from dutiful soldier into conscious rebel. The British radio operator who received Kowalski's unauthorized transmission was Sergeant Major Percival Ashworth of the 11th Armored Division's Signals Squadron, a 38-year-old veteran of the North Africa campaign who had learned to distinguish between routine communications and those that carried life-or-death urgency. British station Zebra 47, this is American station Fox 29 Alpha with priority flash traffic over, Kowalski transmitted. using call signs that he had no authority to employ but which would ensure immediate attention from British communications personnel. Be advised, intercepted German transmissions confirm massive artillery strike on Liège city center, scheduled to commence 0500 hours local time. Repeat, German artillery attack on Liège begins in 2 hours, 27 minutes. This intelligence is confirmed and requires immediate civilian evacuation. Request immediate relay to Belgian civil authorities. Over. The transmission took 43 seconds to complete, 43 seconds during which Kowalski violated approximately 17 separate regulations governing military communications. Sergeant Major Ashworth's response came within 2 minutes. American station Fox 29 Alpha. This is Zebra 47 actual. Confirm you are transmitting intelligence regarding imminent attack on Liège. What is your authorization for this transmission? Over. Kowalski had anticipated this question and prepared his response with careful precision. Zebra 47 actual Fox 29 Alpha is operating under emergency protocols. Time factor prohibits normal authorization procedures. Lives of approximately 200,000 civilians hang in the balance. Respectfully request immediate action regardless of authorization issues. Will accept full responsibility for protocol violations. Over. The radio fell silent for nearly 4 minutes, during which Kowalski imagined Ashworth wrestling with his own version of the same protocol dilemma. British military procedure was, if anything, more rigid than American regarding unauthorized communications, but Ashworth was also an experienced soldier who understood that sometimes survival trumped regulations. When the British Sergeant Major finally responded, his voice carried the weight of a man making a career-defining decision. Fox 29 Alpha, Zebra 47 actual. I am immediately relaying your intelligence to Division Headquarters with recommendation for emergency action. Be advised that your transmission is being recorded and will be subject to post-action review. Whatever the consequences, you have done the right thing. Out. Fiera. Those final words, "You have done the right thing," struck Kowalski like a physical blow, not because they offered comfort, but because they confirmed the magnitude of what he had just done. He had crossed a line from which there could be no return, placed the lives of strangers above the regulations that governed his military existence. But the night was far from over, and one unauthorized transmission would not be sufficient to save Liège. The Belgian Civil Defense Network that received Ashworth's emergency relay had been established in 1939 during the tense months before Germany's invasion of the Low Countries, but it had never been tested under conditions like these. Marcel Delacroix, the 62-year-old director of Liège's Civil Defense Authority, received the British warning at 0257 hours through a direct telephone line that connected his headquarters with Allied military communications. Delacroix had spent the war years developing evacuation procedures that existed primarily on paper, theoretical plans that assumed adequate warning time and favorable conditions. Reality offered him neither. 2 hours remained before the German bombardment would commence, and those 2 hours had to accomplish what his peacetime plans allocated 8 hours to complete. Delacroix faced a logistical nightmare that would have challenged the organizational capabilities of any modern city. Liège's population of just over 200,000 people lived primarily in densely packed neighborhoods surrounding the city's medieval core. Many families lacked automobiles and would depend on public transportation or their own feet to reach safety. The city's air raid shelters, constructed during the early war years, could accommodate perhaps 30,000 people under emergency conditions. Moving the remaining population to safety required coordinating with rural communities throughout the Meuse Valley, organizing transportation for those without vehicles, and maintaining order during what would inevitably be a chaotic mass exodus. Under normal circumstances, such an operation would require days of preparation and careful coordination with regional authorities. Delacroix had 2 hours. But the Belgian civil defense director possessed two crucial advantages that would prove decisive in the coming race against time. First, the winter of 1944 had been unusually severe, driving many rural families into the relative warmth of urban areas, which meant that countryside villages possessed unused housing capacity to accommodate refugees from the city. Second, Liège's location at the confluence of the Meuse and Ourthe rivers provided multiple evacuation routes that German artillery, positioned to the southwest, could not effectively target. Delacroix immediately activated every emergency communication system at his disposal. Civil defense personnel throughout the city received orders to begin immediate door-to-door evacuation notices, while radio broadcasts on civilian frequencies announced the emergency in both French and Flemish. The message was carefully crafted to convey urgency without triggering panic. Citizens of Liège, civil defense authorities have received reliable intelligence indicating imminent military action in the city center. For your safety, you are advised to evacuate immediately to designated reception areas in surrounding communities. Transportation assistance is being organized for those requiring aid. This is not a drill. This evacuation order is effective immediately. The response from Liège's civilian population would later be described by historians as one of the most remarkable examples of civic cooperation under extreme stress ever recorded during the Second World War. What followed during the next 97 minutes defied every expert prediction about civilian behavior during emergency evacuations. Instead of the mass panic that emergency planners feared would paralyze the city's transportation networks, Liège's citizens demonstrated extraordinary discipline and mutual cooperation. Families with automobiles immediately began offering transportation to neighbors without vehicles. Business owners unlocked their trucks and delivery vehicles for evacuation use. Even the city's taxi drivers, notorious for their individualistic attitudes, organized themselves into an impromptu fleet dedicated to moving elderly and disabled residents to safety. The evacuation proceeded with remarkable efficiency, precisely because it was occurring under crisis conditions that stripped away normal social inhibitions against asking for or offering help. Neighbors who had barely spoken during years of routine coexistence suddenly found themselves coordinating complex logistics with the focused intensity of military units. Madame Celeste van der Velde, a 73-year-old widow who lived alone in a third-floor apartment near the cathedral, discovered herself being carried down the stairs by three young men from her building who had never spoken to her before, but who understood instinctively that no one would be left behind. Father Antoine Dufresne, the parish priest of St. Lambert's Church, abandoned his theological objections to working on the Sabbath and organized his entire congregation into teams responsible for evacuating different neighborhoods, treating the emergency as a divine mandate that superseded all other religious obligations. Dr. Marguerite Rousseau, the city's only female physician, commandeered the hospital's ambulance fleet and established mobile medical stations at evacuation assembly points, ensuring that pregnant women and those with serious medical conditions received appropriate care during the exodus. Perhaps most remarkably, the evacuation proceeded without a single recorded instance of looting, violence, or abandonment of civic responsibility. Citizens loaded their possessions with careful attention to essentials: warm clothing, important documents, medications, food, but also demonstrated remarkable consideration for community welfare. Multiple families reported discovering that neighbors had taken responsibility for evacuating their homes and caring for their possessions, even though no such arrangements had been discussed in advance. By 0430 hours, with 30 minutes remaining before the scheduled German bombardment, approximately 170,000 residents had successfully evacuated Liège's central districts. The remaining 30,000 consisted primarily of civil defense personnel, medical workers, and others whose responsibilities required them to remain until the final moment. But even these dedicated individuals had been moved to hardened shelters or positioned in areas calculated to minimize casualties from the coming artillery attack. The evacuation that emergency planners had estimated would require 8 hours of careful preparation had been completed in less than 2 hours through a combination of accurate intelligence, effective leadership, and extraordinary civic cooperation. At 0458 hours, 2 minutes before the scheduled commencement of Operation Vergeltung, Oberst Friedrich Mannheim gave the final fire command to his artillery batteries positioned southwest of Liège. The German colonel had spent the pre-dawn hours in the confident expectation that his regiment would achieve complete tactical surprise against a sleeping city. His intelligence reports, based on reconnaissance conducted 3 days earlier, indicated that Liège contained no significant military targets, but represented an important psychological objective whose destruction would demonstrate German capability to strike at will behind Allied lines. Mannheim had personally calculated the firing solutions for his artillery pieces, ensuring that the initial barrage would target the city's cathedral, municipal buildings, and densely populated residential areas for maximum psychological impact. As the first German shells arced through the freezing morning air toward their intended targets, Mannheim anticipated achieving the kind of devastating success that would earn him commendation from divisional command and perhaps promotion to brigade command. The shells began impacting Liège at precisely 0500 hours, exactly as scheduled, but instead of striking a sleeping city filled with helpless civilians, they exploded against empty buildings and deserted streets. The cathedral that Mannheim had selected as his primary target sustained severe damage to its medieval stonework, but the building contained only one person, Father Dufresne, who had insisted on remaining behind to ensure that his church's sacred artifacts were properly protected, and who survived the bombardment by taking shelter in the cathedral's reinforced crypt. The municipal building, targeted for its symbolic value as the seat of local government, was completely destroyed. But its destruction yielded no casualties because civil defense planners had anticipated precisely this type of attack and had relocated all essential government functions to rural command posts weeks earlier. Even the residential areas that received the heaviest bombardment contained no civilian casualties because the massive evacuation had been completed with nearly surgical precision. The 200 high-explosive shells that German artillery fired into Liège during the 45-minute bombardment created extensive property damage but killed fewer than a dozen people, an outcome so statistically improbable that Mannheim initially suspected his intelligence reports of the attack's effectiveness were deliberately falsified. The incendiary shells that followed the initial high-explosive barrage succeeded in igniting several large fires, but these blazes spread through empty buildings and deserted neighborhoods, creating dramatic visual effects without achieving the mass casualties that German planners had intended. By 0600 hours, when German infantry units began their advance toward Liège, they encountered not a terrorized population cowering in destroyed buildings, but organized resistance from Allied forces who had used the warning time provided by Kowalski's intelligence to prepare defensive positions throughout the city's outskirts. The failure of Operation Vergeltung represented more than a tactical setback for German forces in the Ardennes. It marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in Allied intelligence operations that would characterize the final months of the war in Europe. Kowalski's decision to bypass normal protocols and transmit urgent intelligence directly to forces capable of acting on that information demonstrated the potential effectiveness of decentralized intelligence sharing, particularly in fluid battlefield conditions where traditional command structures struggled to process information rapidly enough to influence events. Within 72 hours of the failed attack on Liège, Allied intelligence officers had developed new procedures specifically designed to accelerate the flow of actionable intelligence from field units to forces capable of responding to immediate threats. These flash intelligence protocols formally authorized radio operators like Kowalski to transmit urgent information directly to appropriate Allied units without waiting for approval through normal command channels. The new procedures included specific code words that would identify transmissions as emergency intelligence, standardized formats for communicating threat information, and explicit protections for operators who made good faith efforts to save Allied lives by sharing critical intelligence. More significantly, the success of the Liège evacuation inspired Allied planners to develop comprehensive civilian protection protocols for other cities threatened by German operations. Intelligence estimates suggested that Wehrmacht planners had identified at least 15 major population centers in Belgium, Luxembourg, and eastern France as potential targets for attacks similar to the one attempted against Liège. But the remarkable civilian cooperation demonstrated during the Liège evacuation proved that properly warned populations could achieve rapid, effective evacuations even under extremely adverse conditions. Within 2 weeks, Allied forces had established direct communication links between military intelligence networks and civilian defense authorities in every major city within 50 miles of the front lines, ensuring that future German attacks would encounter prepared populations rather than helpless targets. The organizational innovations triggered by Kowalski's unauthorized transmission ultimately saved thousands of civilian lives during the final 6 months of the European War, as German forces repeatedly discovered that their surprise attacks were met by empty buildings and organized resistance rather than the defenseless populations they had expected to find. The immediate consequences for Lysander Kowalski proved far more complex than the simple court-martial he had anticipated. Captain Blackstone initially recommended disciplinary action for violation of communications protocols, but his recommendation was overruled by Colonel Thaddeus Beauregard, commanding officer of the 9th Army's Signal Battalion, who recognized that prosecuting a soldier for saving civilian lives would create a public relations nightmare for the U.S. Army. Instead, Kowalski found himself summoned to a closed-door meeting with intelligence officers who wanted to understand exactly how he had intercepted and interpreted the German transmissions that revealed Operation Vergeltung. His ability to extract clear intelligence from atmospheric interference that left other operators hearing only static attracted attention from signals intelligence specialists who were struggling to maintain effective monitoring of German communications as Wehrmacht forces increasingly adopted sophisticated encryption and frequency hopping techniques. Rather than facing punishment, Kowalski discovered that his unauthorized transmission had earned him a transfer to the Office of Strategic Services, where his exceptional radio skills were considered valuable enough to warrant assignment to one of the war's most classified intelligence operations. For the remainder of the European conflict, he worked with Allied code breakers attempting to penetrate German communications networks, using his unusual auditory abilities to isolate enemy transmissions from increasingly complex electronic countermeasures. His work contributed to intelligence successes that remained classified for decades after the war's end, but which contemporary sources suggest included early warning of several major German operations and identification of Wehrmacht command posts that became targets for Allied bombing attacks. The irony was profound. By violating military protocol to save civilian lives, Kowalski had demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and moral judgment that military intelligence services most valued in their personnel. His superiors understood that soldiers capable of making correct decisions under extreme pressure, even when those decisions contradicted explicit orders, possessed precisely the qualities required for unconventional warfare operations, where rigid adherence to protocol could prove fatal. The unauthorized transmission that should have ended his military career instead became the foundation for a new career in intelligence operations that would extend well beyond the conclusion of the European War. But perhaps more importantly for Kowalski personally, his decision to break protocol on that freezing December morning established a pattern of moral courage that would define the rest of his life. The post-war years brought Lysander Kowalski back to Pittsburgh, where he used his wartime experience with communications technology to establish a small electronics repair business that specialized in radio and early television equipment. The business thrived during the late 1940s as American families invested in the consumer technologies that had been unavailable during the war years. But Kowalski's real satisfaction came from the letters he continued to receive from people whose lives had been touched by his decision to transmit that unauthorized warning. Dr. Marguerite Rousseau, the physician who had organized medical care during the Liège evacuation, wrote to him every Christmas until her death in 1967, each letter expressing gratitude for his courage and updating him on the lives of patients who had survived because of the early warning he had provided. Father Dufresne, the priest who had survived the cathedral bombardment, maintained a correspondence that evolved from simple gratitude into genuine friendship, with the Belgian clergyman eventually visiting Pittsburgh in 1953 to meet the man whose decision had saved his parishioners. Perhaps most movingly, Kowalski received hundreds of letters from ordinary citizens of Liège who wanted him to know how his choice had affected their families. These letters arrived sporadically throughout the 1950s and 60s, often containing photographs of family celebrations that had been made possible by the December evacuation. One letter, written in careful English by a woman named Gabrielle Moreau, described how her evacuation from Liège had led to her meeting her future husband at the rural reception center where refugees were housed, resulting in a marriage and family that would never have existed without Kowalski's intervention. Another correspondent, a teacher named Henri Dubois, explained how the destruction of Liège's original school buildings had led to the construction of modern educational facilities that had dramatically improved learning opportunities for an entire generation of Belgian students. These personal testimonies revealed the complex cascade of consequences that had flowed from a single moment of moral courage, demonstrating how one individual's decision to prioritize human life over institutional protocol could reshape the future for thousands of people. Kowalski kept every letter, filing them in a wooden box that he had crafted in his basement workshop, not out of pride but because he understood that these testimonies represented something larger than personal gratitude. They were evidence of the profound impact that ordinary individuals could achieve when they chose conscience over convenience. Military historians studying the Battle of the Bulge have consistently identified the failure of Operation Vergeltung as a crucial factor in the ultimate collapse of Germany's Ardennes offensive. The German High Command had calculated that successful attacks on Belgian population centers would create refugee flows that would clog Allied supply lines while simultaneously undermining civilian morale and creating pressure for negotiated settlement of the war. The complete failure of the Liège attack, combined with similar failures against other Belgian cities that had been warned by the improved intelligence procedures developed after Kowalski's transmission, forced Wehrmacht planners to abandon their strategy of targeting civilian populations and concentrate their remaining resources on direct military objectives. This shift in German tactical focus proved catastrophic because it eliminated the element of surprise that had made the initial Ardennes offensive so successful and concentrated German forces in areas where Allied units could bring superior firepower and air support to bear most effectively. Intelligence analyses conducted after the war revealed that German commanders had allocated nearly 30% of their available artillery ammunition for Operation Vergeltung, expecting that successful civilian attacks would provide strategic advantages that would offset the reduced firepower available for direct military operations. When those civilian attacks failed completely, German forces found themselves critically short of ammunition for sustained combat against reorganizing Allied units, contributing directly to the rapid collapse of the Ardennes offensive after December 26th. More broadly, the failure of German psychological warfare operations against Belgian civilians demonstrated the resilience of democratic societies under extreme stress and contributed to growing recognition among German military leaders that the war had become unwinnable. Internal Wehrmacht communications intercepted by Allied intelligence during January 1945 contained explicit acknowledgments that German forces could no longer achieve strategic objectives through terror tactics, forcing a return to conventional military operations for which Germany lacked sufficient resources. The strategic implications of Kowalski's decision extended far beyond the immediate salvation of Liège's civilian population. By enabling effective civilian evacuations and facilitating Allied preparation for German attacks, his unauthorized transmission helped accelerate the conclusion of the European war by months, potentially saving thousands of additional military and civilian lives that would have been lost during extended combat operations. Modern military doctrine continues to study the Liège incident as an example of how individual initiative can achieve strategic impact when institutional procedures prove inadequate to address rapidly developing situations. The broader lessons of Lysander Kowalski's story resonate through every subsequent conflict in which American forces have participated. Military education institutions now teach the Liège Protocol as an example of constructive insubordination, situations where adherence to regulations would produce results contrary to the fundamental mission and values of military service. Staff colleges analyze Kowalski's decision-making process as a case study in rapid ethical evaluation under extreme pressure, examining how individual soldiers can distinguish between beneficial rule-breaking that serves larger institutional purposes and destructive insubordination that undermines military effectiveness. The communications protocols developed after the failure of Operation Vergeltung have evolved into modern procedures that continue to govern military information sharing during crisis situations, ensuring that urgent intelligence can reach decision-makers rapidly enough to influence events. Perhaps most significantly, Kowalski's story illustrates the fundamental principle that military service ultimately serves human welfare rather than abstract institutional authority, and that the best soldiers are those capable of recognizing when institutional procedures conflict with human welfare and acting appropriately to resolve that conflict. Modern military personnel receive training in ethical decision-making that explicitly addresses scenarios similar to the one Kowalski faced, emphasizing the importance of moral courage and the responsibility of individual service members to take appropriate action when institutional systems fail to respond adequately to humanitarian crises. The story of the radio operator who saved a city has become more than historical anecdote. It has evolved into a fundamental component of military ethics education that continues to influence how armed forces prepare personnel for the complex moral challenges they will face in contemporary conflicts. But beyond its institutional significance, Kowalski's story represents something even more profound, proof that ordinary individuals possess the capacity to change history through single moments of moral courage, and that the most important battles are often fought not against external enemies, but against the internal temptation to choose convenience over conscience, protocol over principle, institutional safety over human welfare. In an era when individual agency often seems overwhelmed by massive institutional forces, the story of Lysander Kowalski reminds us that one person's decision to act according to conscience rather than convention can literally save thousands of lives and reshape the course of events in ways that echo through generations. The mathematical precision of courage reveals itself most clearly in moments like the one Lysander Kowalski faced during those crucial minutes in his frozen Belgian bunker. The calculations were brutally simple. Following protocol meant certain death for thousands of innocent people, while breaking protocol meant accepting personal responsibility for consequences that could include court-martial, imprisonment, and the end of his military career. The odds against successfully alerting Allied forces were substantial. The probability of civilian cooperation was unknown, and the likelihood of effective evacuation under combat conditions was entirely theoretical. Yet Kowalski made his choice based not on probability calculations, but on the fundamental recognition that some actions are morally required regardless of personal cost or institutional consequences. His unauthorized transmission represents the kind of moral mathematics that transcends traditional risk assessment, situations where the magnitude of potential suffering makes personal consequences irrelevant, and where individual conscience becomes the only reliable guide to appropriate action. The success of the Liège evacuation proved that extraordinary human cooperation becomes possible when people understand that their individual choices directly affect the survival of their community. But that cooperation required the initial catalyst of accurate intelligence delivered by someone willing to sacrifice personal safety for collective welfare. Modern emergency management continues to study the Liège evacuation as an example of optimal civilian response under extreme stress. But the organizational excellence demonstrated by Belgian civil defense authorities and ordinary citizens would have been meaningless without the early warning that made preparation possible. The cascade of events that began with Kowalski's decision to transmit unauthorized intelligence ultimately saved not just the immediate victims of German bombardment, but countless others whose lives were preserved by the improved procedures and enhanced civilian protection measures that developed from analysis of the Liège incident. Historical analysis suggests that similar German attacks against unprepared populations during the final months of the war killed an average of nearly 3,000 civilians per attack, meaning that the procedures inspired by Kowalski's actions potentially prevented tens of thousands of deaths during the remaining 6 months of combat in Europe. The mathematics of individual moral courage become even more compelling when extended across time to encompass the descendants of people whose lives were preserved by decisions made during moments of crisis, creating generational impacts that multiply exponentially across decades. Every family photograph taken in post-war Liège, every graduation ceremony, every wedding celebration, every quiet dinner shared by elderly couples who survived because someone chose conscience over protocol. All of these represent the continuing dividend of one man's decision to break rules in service of higher principles. The question that Lysander Kowalski's story poses to every individual who encounters it transcends historical context and speaks directly to the moral choices that define human character. Would you have sent that transmission? Would you have risked your career, your freedom, perhaps your life, to save strangers whose names you would never know and whose gratitude you might never receive? The comfortable distance of historical perspective makes it easy to claim moral courage, but genuine ethical testing occurs only in moments when personal cost is immediate and certain, while potential benefits remain distant and theoretical. Kowalski faced his moment of testing at 0230 hours on December 22, 1944, in a freezing bunker 40 miles from the nearest friendly forces, with German artillery preparing to obliterate a city full of sleeping families. He had approximately 30 seconds to decide whether to follow the regulations that governed his military service or violate those same regulations in service of principles that transcended institutional authority. The choice he made established a legacy that continues to influence military ethics, emergency management procedures, and civilian protection protocols more than 80 years after that frozen December morning. But perhaps more importantly, his choice demonstrates that history's most crucial moments often depend not on the decisions of generals or politicians, but on the moral courage of ordinary individuals who find themselves in positions where their actions can determine whether thousands of people live or die. The story of the radio operator who saved Liège stands as permanent testimony to the power of individual conscience to triumph over institutional inertia, to the capacity of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results when they choose principle over protocol, and to the profound truth that the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the internal temptation to choose safety over service, convenience over courage, compliance over conscience. In a world where individual agency is often dismissed as powerless against massive institutional forces, Kowalski's story proves that one person's decision to act according to moral conviction rather than institutional expectations can literally change the course of history and save thousands of lives. The transmission he sent during those desperate pre-dawn hours represents more than successful intelligence sharing. It stands as proof that courage, conscience, and individual moral action remain the most powerful forces for human welfare in a world that too often seems dominated by indifferent institutions and overwhelming circumstances. Comment below and share this story, so others remember what courage really means when everything depends on one person's willingness to choose principle over protocol, to risk everything for strangers, and to prove that individual moral action can triumph over institutional inertia when human lives hang in the balance.